Acts chapter 24. Look where we got to. On Drusilla. Yeah, I think we just talked about Drusilla. So we're getting ready for, Paul is standing before Felix at this time. And starting in verse 22, it says, "But when Felix heard these things, having more accurate knowledge of the way, he adjourned the proceedings and said, 'When Lysias, the commander, comes down, I will make a decision in your case.' And he commanded the centurion to keep Paul, to let him have liberty, and told him not to forbid any of his friends to provide for or visit him." And so Paul was given liberty, and that's a theme we'll see as we go through chapter 25, really through chapter 28, is that wherever Paul was bound, he was still given liberty to be able to go, or not go, but do what he needed, people to visit him. And that helps us because we get to see that these prison epistles that Paul wrote. Sunday morning, or the sermon we're looking at, 2 Timothy, that's one of the last books, I think it's believed to be the last book that Paul wrote, and he was in prison during that time. And so being able to write, be able to have people visit, he was still able to do a lot. And that's what we see here. And he was 2 years waiting for this time. And so we get to verse 24. It says, "And after some time, when Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish, he sent for Paul and heard him concerning the faith in Christ." So we talked about the history behind Drusilla and Felix and the fact that she was not lawfully married to him, and they both had a really messed up past in that sense. And so it leads to what we see in verse 25. It says, "Now as he reasoned about righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come, Felix was afraid and answered, 'Go away for now. When I have convenient time, I will call for you.'" And so he reasoned. Paul did this everywhere he went. I've been reading through the book of Acts again, and it's amazing how many times we see that word used with Paul in reasoning. And the idea of reasoning is not an argue. It's not trying to tell somebody that they're wrong, but trying to show them through Scripture. And so Paul did the same thing here with Felix. He's trying to show him through Scripture that really we're not told what he said, but we're told that he reasoned about righteousness. What is righteousness? Okay, doing the right thing. It is what is right. Was because of the past that we looked at with Drusilla and Felix, was Felix living the right way? No, neither was Drusilla. They're both sitting here listening to Paul. So Paul is saying, the life, she's a Jew. So she grew up knowing the Old Testament and the laws. She knew what was right and wrong. And so with Paul standing there showing her that it was wrong, it was going to make her uncomfortable. And so it says righteousness, self-control. Did Felix show self-control? What did we mention with his past with Drusilla and how it came to be that they were married? Remember, he saw her, was already married, she was married, saw her and worked his, magic, I guess you could say, to get her to marry him. And so he didn't have self-control. And so that's obviously something Paul dealt with. And then the judgment to come, showing that if he didn't change those things, if he didn't follow with what God said, he was going to be judged on that. And so you can imagine what Felix was thinking here. And it tells us that he was afraid. Why was he afraid? Yeah, he knew. He knew that he was wrong. He knew what he was doing was wrong. And it's never comfortable for someone to sit down and show you that you're wrong. Never is for anybody. How we react with that determines, the future. If we leave and think about it and change, or if we say, I need to fix that, that's the good way of doing it. But as we see here, what was Felix's reaction? He says, "Go away for now. When I have a convenient time, I will call for you." Think about that. He was afraid, but says he sends him away until a convenient time. What would be the purpose of time there for Felix? Huh? Yeah, well, we're going to see that is money. Yes, part of it is money. But another thing is, he wants to forget about it. So let's send Paul away so that we don't have to hear anymore and we don't have to feel uncomfortable. And that's what he did here. Send him away so that he didn't have to hear anymore about this message. And so it says, go away for a convenient time. Did that convenient time ever come? No. We're never told of a time that time came. We are told that he called for Paul, and they would converse, and the hope was that Paul would pay him money. Well, that conversing, that idea there is just a small talk. He's calling for Paul. He's saying, hey, how you doing? Things like that. Just waiting for Paul to say, hey, let me go. Here's some money. And so that time never came. And the thing is how many times do people say that? They may not say it out loud, but say that in their head. I'm going to wait till more convenient time. Has that convenient time ever come for anybody? No. I've heard people say, when I'm older, I will follow God. I will do what God wants me to do. That doesn't happen. Very rarely. Huh? Yeah. That's the thing. We may never get the chance. So that convenient time may never have the opportunity to come because our lives can change quickly. So we read 2 Corinthians 6 and verse 2.
For he says, in a favorable time I listened to you, and in a day of salvation I have helped you. Behold, now is the favorable time. Behold, now is the day of salvation.
So you think about it, today is the day. Today is the day to make a change. Today is the day because if we don't know what tomorrow may bring. 2 Peter 3 and verse 10.
But the day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night. Heavens will pass away with a great noise, and the elements will melt with fervent heat. Both the earth and the works that are in it will be burned up.
Okay, Jesus is going to come back as a thief in the night. So the urgency is always there. We talk about urgency many times through the New Testament. That urgency is there. And so we need to be ready. And so unfortunately, I think this example of Felix falls within this realm of most people when they hear the gospel. They hear it, they have a reaction. He had the same reaction as those on the day of Pentecost had, but their reaction, they were cut to the heart. They were afraid in a sense, but they reacted upon that, and they changed. Many of them changed their lives. Many of them were baptized. But his reaction was, I'm going to put it off. I'm just going to get away from this situation. I don't want to feel bad anymore. I want to get out of this uncomfortable situation. And many people do that. And so we got to be careful. We got to be careful of that. Even for us personally, we're Christians here, but sometimes we do things that we need to change. We grow as we grow, and so sometimes we need to stop and think, do I need to do something different? Because we may want to put it off. We may say, you know what, I'll just do that later. Maybe I'll start reading my Bible later. Maybe I'll start doing XYZ thing later, because I'm just too busy right now. That time never comes, really. And so we can learn from this example. All right, so verse 26 says, "Meanwhile, he also hoped that money would be given him by Paul, and he might release him. Therefore, he sent for him more often and conversed with him." And so he hoped that Paul would pay a bribe with him and let him go. This is something that happened a lot then. Money talked. If you had money, you could get out of stuff. And so he is desiring for Paul, thinking that Paul would, maybe with all of these people visiting him, get money from his visitors and bring it to him. And so then he would just let him go. But if he had let Paul go, what would have happened to Paul? Yeah, he probably would have been killed. So it wasn't really for what Paul wanted to do or needed to do, because, of course, what we see, especially as we get into the next chapter, the people, the Jews, are still desiring to kill him. They still wanted to jump him on the road and kill him. And so here he's calling for money. And so during that time he waited, he would have conversations with him. The word converse, Mount says, is to be in the company with, associated with, to converse with, or talk with. He would just have small talk with him. He would call him and just waiting for that chance that Paul would just hand him money. But that day never came. And so then look at verse 27. It says, but after 2 years, Porcius Festus succeeded Felix, and Felix, wanting to do the Jews a favor, left Paul bound. And so this went on for 2 years. Could you imagine? Well, Paul's bound. In a way, he's still able to see people visit him. He had liberty, but for 2 years nothing happened. What does that say about what Felix was doing here? Huh? Yeah, he was very determined in making sure he got some money. But then also, as we're going to see in the next chapter, Festus, who replaced him, he's trying to pass the buck on someone else. He doesn't want to deal with it. Because you notice the last part, he says, wanting to do the Jews a favor, he left Paul bound. He didn't want to upset the Jews. Now, you got to think about the province that they're in is Judea. It's going to be mainly Jews. So if you do something against what the Jews want, it's going to cause an uprising, cause a mob. Then that is going to get back to Rome. Caesar then would be upset with that governor and replace him. And so they don't want to upset the Jews. And that's what we see happen here. Instead of standing up for what he knew was right, because he knew Paul wasn't guilty, and we're going to see that in the next chapter also with Festus. Festus knew he wasn't guilty, but they didn't have the backbone, in a sense, to stand up to the Jews and say, you know what, we're just going to release him and go on. And so Kaufman said this: the occasion of Felix's recall was the outbreak of civil strife between the Jews. I added this part, you don't have this, sorry. Strife between the Jewish and Gentile elements of Caesarea, in which Felix's intervention with troops led to the slaughter of many Jews, revealing perhaps his true feelings about them. Through the intervention of his brother Paulus, he received no punishment beyond that of removal from office, which was taken by Festus. So Josephus talks about how Felix went and killed many Jews because of the conflict between them and the Gentiles, and that led to him being replaced or removed from his position. So he wasn't in power very long, but as we're going to see with Festus, he wasn't either. History tells us. So that's the end of chapter 24. Any questions on that? All right. Let's move to chapter 25 then. And let's read verse 1 through 12, please. Okay, and somebody else can do 6 to 12, please.
Now when Festus had come to the province after 3 days, he went up from Caesarea to Jerusalem. Then the high priest and the chief men of the Jews informed him against Paul, and they petitioned him, asking a favor against him, that he would summon him to Jerusalem, while they lay in ambush along the road to kill him. But Festus answered that Paul should be kept at Caesarea, and that he himself was going there shortly. Therefore he said, let those who have authority among you go down with me and accuse this man to see if there is any fault in him. And when he had remained among them more than 10 days, he went down to Caesarea, and the next day, sitting on the judgment seat, he commanded Paul to be brought.
When he had arrived, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him, bringing many and serious charges against him that they could not prove. Paul argued in his defense, neither against the law of the Jews, nor against the temple, nor against Caesar have I committed any offense. But Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, said to Paul, do you wish to go up to Jerusalem and there be tried on these charges before me? But Paul said, I am standing before Caesar's tribunal, where I ought to be tried. To the Jews I have done no wrong, as you yourself know very well. If then I am a wrongdoer and have committed anything for which I deserve to die, I do not seek to escape death. But if there is nothing to their charges against me, no one can give me up to them. I appeal to Caesar. Then Festus, when he had conferred with his council, answered, to Caesar you have appealed, to Caesar you shall go.
Okay, so Festus. Now, we don't know much about Festus before he became governor of Judea. We're not really told much in history. Josephus says that Felix, or Festus, was wise, just, and agreeable man. But the problem is that really doesn't fit within the text. So Josephus says that he spoke well of Festus. Now, we got to remember about Josephus, if you know much about history about him. He was a Roman sympathizer. So the Jews hated Rome. And so Josephus, though, was a Roman sympathizer. And even to the fact that when Rome came and destroyed Jerusalem in AD 70, he sat on a hill watching the destruction of Jerusalem and writing about it. He was on the side of, not really on the side of Rome, but he was a sympathizer of Rome. So he didn't speak against it. He didn't, nothing. He just wrote the tragedy that was there. But we see that kind of gives us an idea of how he speaks about some of these Roman leaders this time, because he lived during this time. And so Josephus said that Festus was wise, just, and agreeable. But if you look at the text, Festus was, wanting to please the Jews in whatever he did. And so he wasn't really someone who was just and wise, but yet more scared of his position and losing it. He was ready to sacrifice Paul for the Jews. We're going to see that in this text. Kaufman said this: the incompetence of Festus must have been laughingstock of the whole temple crowd in Jerusalem. He was naive, totally ignorant of the devices of the people he had come to rule, agreeable, gullible, and obsessed with such a desire for popularity that he would gladly have sacrificed an innocent man to enhance his standing with the Sanhedrins. And so that's exactly what we see here. He goes to Jerusalem, as we've read, and he is basically run over by the Jews and fell to their feet in wanting to do them a favor. And so he came to be governor about 60 AD and was appointed by Nero. But he was only governor for 2 years and died. History tells us. He didn't last very long. And so this roughly is the time frame we get an idea of what is going on here. This is about AD 60 when this is all going on. Because the first verse tells us that he had come to the province about 3 days. He went up from Caesarea to Jerusalem. And that's interesting because Caesarea is the capital of this province. It's a Roman colony. It's a port city. This is where Rome would do all of their work. Of course, Herod's Praetorium was here, his court, and all of that. And so why would he go to Jerusalem just 3 days into arriving to this province? Why do you think that would be the case? What would be important about Jerusalem? That's where, he's the leader of Judea. Jerusalem is where the Jews is at. This is where the Sanhedrin's at. This is where the center of the Jewish faith is at. And so even just arriving to this province, he didn't spend very much time in Caesarea. He immediately leaves and goes to Jerusalem. And as we see, he went from Jerusalem to find the high priests and the chief men of the Jews. And they quickly find each other. And that's verse 2 and 3. And so we see it says, and the high priest and chief men of the Jews informed him against Paul, and they petitioned him. They informed him of Paul. You think about that phrase, I think about that. It's kind of like someone starting at a new job, and someone comes up to them and says, I'm going to tell you about everybody that works here. You ever had that happen? Yeah. And so that's exactly what they're doing. They know that he's now the new governor. They want to make sure he's on their side. So they quickly find him, and they say, okay, now we're going to tell you about some of the things that's going on. And specifically, we're going to tell you about this man, Paul. And so Festus has not met Paul yet. He doesn't know this case. He's only been, Paul is probably only is one of several people that are in prison during this time. But they were very focused on making sure they told him about Paul. And so it says they petitioned him. The word petition means to call to one side, to invite. This is going to be a word that we're going to see later in our sermon in 2 Peter chapter 3 and chapter 4 and verse 2. That the word that's used here is the same word that is used to exhort in 2 Timothy 4 and verse 2. It means to call to one side. It means to invite. And so in reference to 2 Timothy 4 and verse 2, when we teach someone the gospel, we are inviting them. We are calling them to our side. So we're saying we want you in the church. We want you on our side. We want you on God's side. And so that is exactly what this word means in the use here. The Jews, they find Festus and they say, we want you on our side. So they're inviting him. They're calling him to their side. And so then verse 3, it says, asking a favor against him. The word favor here means grace. It's the same word we see many other places that is translated grace. What is grace? Okay, unmerited favor. That's the use when we see it used in reference to God we're saved by grace of God's favor. That's this word that's used here. It's almost like they're trying to get him to do what they want in exchange for their favor. So they're asking a favor of him. But that word doesn't really mean a favor as in what we would say, how we would use it today. It's more in a reference of saying, you do this and you'll find our favor. So it's not unmerited in this sense, but they're using it to say, you do this, we'll be on your side. We will help you. You will find our favor. You'll have our support, the Sanhedrin support, if you do this one thing for us. Well, what is that one thing? It said, verse 3, that he would summon Paul to Jerusalem while they lay in ambush along the road to kill him. Now, I don't think they told him that part. I don't think they said that we want you to summon him to Jerusalem because we want to kill Paul. Festus then would have been obligated to protect Paul, being a Roman. He wouldn't be able to do that. So I think that's more of a commentary on Luke's part for us to say this is what they were thinking. Because that's exactly what they did before. And so they're trying it with him now. They're saying, okay, why don't you just bring him down here and we're going to judge him in our court. And that's the right thing to do. Do us this one favor. Seems simple. He doesn't know. He's pretty gullible. He doesn't know that they're trying to kill him. Doesn't know the history. But notice what he says. But Festus answered that Paul should be kept at Caesarea and that he himself was going there shortly. Therefore he said, let those who have the authority among you go down with me and accuse this man to see if there's any fault in him. Now, I don't know why. It doesn't tell us why Festus then said this. But he states that he wants Paul to stay at Caesarea. Now, think about it in this way. What would have it looked like if Festus had released Paul to them and not judged him himself? Yeah, it looked like he was be weak, right? He really didn't have a purpose or a position. He's 3 days into his reign as governor, and they're wanting to take Paul out of his hands and just bypass him and his judging and his ruling of the situation. And so his pride gets in the way here. He's saying, you know what, no, he's going to stay where I'm at. I'm going to sit on my throne. I'm going to judge this. You bring your people up. And so that's exactly what happens. And so then look at verse 6. It says, and when he had remained among them more than 10 days, he went down to Caesarea. And the next day, sitting on the judgment seat, he commanded Paul to be brought. And so after 10 days, he spends 10 days in Jerusalem, getting to know the city, the people there. He goes back to Caesarea, sits down on his throne, and calls for Paul. And there the chief, verse 7, and when he had come, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood about and laid many serious complaints against Paul, which they could not prove. And so they laid many serious. I think that's interesting. It says serious. Why would they say serious? Why would Luke say serious complaints? Yeah. Yeah, exactly. They're trying to make the case. I think it's interesting he doesn't say serious charges. He says, it does say serious charges, really. So that would lay on the fact that they're trying to set some charge against him. I have to look at that. I didn't look at that word any in depth, but they're trying to lay a case against Paul, but they can't. So these serious complaints, they had no proof. There was no way to charge someone without proof. For him, Festus, it would be stupid to say, okay, yeah, I believe that, even though they had no witnesses, no evidence, and then condemn Paul. His hands are tied. He can't do this. And so that's why Paul says what he does in verse 8. It says, while he answered for him, neither against the laws of the Jews nor against the temple, nor against Caesar have I offended in anything at all. Paul is saying, there is nothing that I have done wrong. Now, we're not told of the details of the serious charges that they're trying to put against Paul, but we are given a kind of a summary by Paul. First, it was they laid charges against him for laws of the Jews. So that is in their sense trying to say, okay, well, Paul needs to be judged by us because he has gone against the law of our land and of our religion, and we should judge him. Against the temple was sacred. And so similar things that we have seen them charge Paul with before. But then the third one, it says, against Caesar. That's ultimately against Rome. So they're trying to lay the case that Paul has done something against Rome, against Caesar, that he should be then judged and condemned for that. Paul says, there's nothing. You have nothing. If it was true, these accusations would be important. They would be condemning for him. But Paul says they have nothing. And so verse 9, it says, but Festus, wanting to do the Jews a favor, answered Paul and said, are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and there be judged before me concerning these things? So he says, you know what? I'll ask him. He wants to do the Jews a favor. They've already asked him to bring Paul down to Jerusalem. He's saying, Okay, are you willing then to go to Jerusalem with me, and I will judge you down there? Now, Paul's been through this before, so he knows that if he leaves Caesarea and goes back to Jerusalem, he's going to get jumped. They're going to try to kill him. Festus doesn't know this. It doesn't indicate at all that Festus understands that, because I think that supports what we see back in verse 3, where it's just a commentary that Luke's telling us their intentions, because if he really knew that Paul was going to be jumped on the way to Jerusalem, he could not do that. He would not be able to take Paul down there.
Does that put Festus in the same position as like the jailer, who, if some of the prisoners under his control escape, then Festus is going to be executed also if he allows this to happen?
That's a good question, because, I mean, ultimately, the people that were protecting Paul would have probably lost their life. But it is different in the sense if he had known that they were going to jump him and willing to let it do it, probably could have. Probably could have. If he knew they were going to jump him and he was conspiring with them, and him being a Roman citizen, he probably would have been killed or had the same fate. I didn't think about that. So, you know, he would definitely be scared for his life if he knew they were going to jump him and kill Paul. And so he doesn't want to do that.
I think it's interesting that he asked Paul's opinion. Like,
Yeah.
hey, you want to go do this? Like,
It is interesting.
obviously, you're going to say no. Like, why would I go back where I know I'm not wanted? But,
Yeah.
maybe.
Yeah. Maybe he respected Paul in that sense, and the fact that, you know what, I'm going to see what he thinks. He's trying to play both sides here. He's trying to protect Paul, and because he knows Paul's innocent, we're going to see that. But he's also trying to be favorable with the Jews, and so trying to work something.
I think he's just stupid because earlier you said that he was kind of a gullible person
Mhm.
who couldn't really make his mind.
So that's Kaufman's idea, is that he was very gullible, and so he just easily got ran over by anybody that was around him. So yeah, it could be.
Just becoming an officer, ruler, and having to deal with something this critical. That'd be tough.
It would be, for sure. And so he's trying to play both sides. He's trying to do the right thing, but also keep the Jews happy. And of course, Paul, he doesn't want to do that. And I think this is God's providence working here. This could have been bad for Paul. Festus could have said, you know what, we're going to take you to Jerusalem. And then Paul would have been in danger again. And so I think God, of course, is working here in his providence here. And so then verse 9 it says, or verse 10, so Paul said, I stand at Caesar's judgment seat where I ought to be judged. To the Jews I have done nothing wrong. that he was wrong, that he could go to Caesar's seat. He would then have to be transported to Rome to stand before Caesar. And it stated also, according to the Julian law, that if he didn't take Paul, he would then lose his life. He would then find the fate of Paul. And so it ties Festus' hands, but it also relieves him of the duty of dealing with it. But think about this. He's going to have to send a letter, which we're going to see that in the next chapter, and it's really Pilate that does this. Or Agrippa, not Pilate. But what is Festus going to say? He's got to send a letter. What is he going to be able to say? That's going to be tough, right? Yeah. He knows Paul's innocent. So really all he could say is, well, you know what? He wanted to go before you. But it makes Festus look bad because here is an innocent man that is appealing to Caesar. That's saying that his judgment, his ability to govern is not very good. And so to the Caesar at that time, he's going to say, maybe I should replace him. Because this little trivial matter that really should have been dealt with to him, to Caesar, is now his problem to deal with. And so, it looks bad for Festus, but it also relieves him of the duty of having to deal with it and keep his influence and his governing. And so now he can turn to the Jews and say, I'm sorry, he can't do nothing about it. He's a Roman citizen. He wants to go before Caesar. I can't rule in this matter. And so then verse 12 it says, but after 2 years, Porcius Festus succeeded Felix, and Felix, wanting to do the Jews a favor, or not, I'm in the wrong spot, sorry. Verse 12. Then Festus, when he had conferred with the council, answered, you have appealed to Caesar you shall go. And so he was going to stand before Paul, or before Caesar. But before that happens, he's going to stand before Agrippa and Bernice. And that's a whole other story that we'll talk about next week. Any questions or comments? Huh?
Snow arrived.
Good.
Snowing good.
Salt like it too.
You did?
I want